say, a movie of some substance again, rather than something that's light and fluffy, and certainly appropriate. And I'm talking about The Drover's Wife, The Legend of Molly Johnson, which is MA rated and runs for 108 minutes. Magnificently shot. It's a story of hardship concerning a woman living in the Australian bush, trying her best to raise 4 young children. And her name is Molly Johnson, played by Leah Purcell. As the title suggests, she's the wife of a drover in the snowy mountains who the drover disappears for months at a time. And we're talking about 1893. As we're introduced to her, we also see that she's having alarming flashbacks. Now, Molly is no shrinking violet. She's highly capable, she's independent, she's resolute. She has a great deal of faith in her eldest son, 12-year-old Danny, played by Malachi Dow Roberts. He's wide-eyed, he's impressionable, and he's responsible. Now, Molly Johnson is visited by the new lawman in the region, Sergeant Nate Clintoff. Sam Reed plays that character, and his wife, Louisa, Jessica DeGow. They have travelled from England. She has an immediate impact on them, she being Molly Johnson. Firstly, greeting them with the barrel of a gun. Thank you very much indeed. And impressing them with her stoicism. Sergeant Clintoff's first case is a murder investigation. 6 people lay dead, including children. The prime suspect is an Indigenous man called Yadaka, Rob Collins. Unbeknown to Molly, wanted posters are in wide circulation. And then he turns up wounded outside her place. Although suspicious due to her personal circumstances, she agrees to give him brief refuge, after which Yadaka bonds with her eldest son, Danny. Mind you, the trio's ordeals have only just begun. This movie, The Drover's Wife, The Legend of Molly Johnson, combines the poetic and lyrical with a more conventional narrative arc. And it's been inspired by Purcell's personal stories and incorporates her own lived experience and those of her ancestors. It's a reimagining of her play and Henry Lawson's classic short story. Now, as an actor, because she's far more than that in this production, Purcell excels, investing very heavily in her role. And she also wrote it, she directed it, she co-produces the piece. So it takes a while, though, to get to the meat of the story. That's my only reservation, because it sort of reminded me of a movie that I thought was really powerful as well, The Nightingale, which came out in 2018, Peter.
Absolutely, The Nightingale was a great film. Look, I was quite impressed by Drover's Wife, especially the feminist reimagining of Henry Lawson's story and of the outback Australia that was fraught with so many issues in terms of the treatment of Indigenous people and also of women. So I liked, even though it's slightly anachronistic insofar as the way the story progresses, it doesn't matter, because Leah Purcell has a very strong point to make about how difficult Australian history has been and how it has treated Aboriginals and women so badly. I liked the sort of the nasty atmosphere that pervades the film. I think it's realistic insofar as what that time period would have been like. And Leah Purcell is just superb front and centre in directing herself and pushing forward such a powerful character, and the relationship she has with her older son and with the various people around her. This is not a pleasant film to watch in many respects, but then you wouldn't expect it to be. And as you've alluded to The Nightingale, it does deal with Australia not being a very pleasant place in the 19th century for anyone who was not white. And so the whole notion of the Australian outback western, which we've seen in other films, is very well presented in the superb widescreen cinematography of this film. Look, I really enjoyed it. I think it's a very powerful and an important film, and I think audiences will get a great deal out of it. But keep in mind that it is not a rose-coloured view of what 19th century life in Australia was like at all. And knowing that, I think you'll appreciate the film.
Well, the cinematography by Mark Wareham, who did Don't Tell, I thought it was breathtaking. I mean, it's hard to get enough of those astounding vistas. And if it's seen overseas, I think you ought to go and visit. That's kind of, it's remarkable from a tourism perspective, and I know this is not a pleasant walk in the park. It's about as good as I've seen. It really struck me that Mark Wareham has created something special. So,
yes.
I mean, what I was also going to say, though, Peter, I was going to ask you, I thought it took a while to get into it. There's a telling conversation about a half hour or so in that changes the dynamic, gives the film a greater sense of urgency and alarm, and I thought it needed that. I think there are going to be people who are impatient saying, well, what's all this about?
I don't quite agree, because I think what Leah Purcell has done is to set up a romanticised view of what 19th century outback Australia might have been like, and she gradually gets the audience involved in the characters, in sort of a more benign sort of story, and then the whammy starts to appear, and I think that's very cleverly done, that it's not completely pervasive from the start of the film. So I think I like the way the narrative was weaved together in such a way that we get interested in her story, original story, and her situation, and then we really find out the nastiness of that period.
But how can you say romanticised? From the very get-go, you've got barrel of a gun, you've got visions of past, all of that stuff. I mean, that sets it up as something that is disturbing. So that's not romanticised.
Look, the romanticised insofar as we would expect that sort of scenario in that sort of situation. But there's nothing malevolent in particular that appears until a bit later on. And I think that's why it works so well, lulling you into the idea that this thing is going to just work out dramatically, but it may not.
No, I saw it differently, Dave. What about you? Did you think the beginning was appropriate, or do you think there should have been a little bit more activity early on in the first half hour?
No, I agree with Peter. I thought that Leah Purcell has set this up in such a way that audiences will kind of watch that opening 15, 20 minutes and think that they're about to get a female version of Man from Snowy River. You've also got that couple arriving, which reminded me of the storyline that we're seeing in the streaming series at the moment, 1888, where people think, oh, they're on a huge adventure. This is going to be fantastic. We've got this new life, and then they realise that the harshness of the Australian wilderness and what that harshness is. I thought that Leah Purcell did that quite well, because you almost see things, even though it's coming from her character's point of view, you almost see that world through the view of the lawman and his wife, where it's like this exciting new adventure. But my one thing that I did feel with this film was I thought that when it needed to be harsh, it didn't become harsh enough. I wanted this film to feel like Kriv Stenders' Lucky Country or The Nightingale, but it didn't. It seemed to take that same route as the Legend of Ben Hall did a few years ago, where it wanted to hint at this harshness but didn't go for that complete harshness. I mean, people got up and walked out of The Nightingale because they thought that some of the scenes went too far, but I thought this was the kind of film where, as an audience, you almost need to feel disgust. You need to feel angry at what happened during this time period to characters like Leah Purcell's character. And I don't think I felt that in the same way as I did with Nightingale or Lucky Country, where I was angry and kind of disgusted. So I loved the film. I just thought that it could have been that little bit more harsher to get its point across even stronger.
What about Malachi Dower Roberts? A really strong presence as that youngster who's seen and heard far too much at a tender age, though.
Oh, definitely, and that reminded me as well of Lucky Country with Hannah Mangan Lawrence's character that is the same. I don't know if you both remember Lucky Country, but that's a film about a dad that takes his two kids out into the South Australian wilderness to start a new life, thinking it's going to be all rosy, and then it turns harsh. I think having it come through the eyes of a child is such a great way to do it, because it there's that innocence where children will always look at things with an innocent point of view, and then when they look at what's happening, they soon realize the darkness of it. And it's almost the same as what happens here with the lawman's wife. She has the same kind of view, where at first she's like, oh wow, this woman is running this property and doing such a great job, and then she starts to see the harshness of what's happening as she gets sicker as well.
Well, the other thing that's evocative we haven't spoken about, the original music by Saliana Seven Gamble. I thought that was another highlight of The Drover's Wife. Let me put into context, it's interesting, Jackie Hamilton saw it more my way, I suspect, than you guys. The Drover's Wife starts unevenly with a directorial awkwardness, that's how she describes it, but it snuck up on me. And soon I was hooked on the story of the kick-ass, abused, defiant Molly Johnson, magnificently portrayed, as we all agree, by Leah Purcell. I'm not sure, now this is Jackie's view, I'm not sure why the word wife was in the title, unless she says it was being ironic. We saw a fiercely devoted mother, a victim, and a powerhouse in a heartbreaking life. Purcell's character is ably backed by the screen presence of Rob Collins and newcomer Malachi Dower Roberts, as well as the film's stunning cinematography of the Australian high country and the riveting historic narrative, which sometimes left me gasping at the intensity and poetry. So there you go. I think that's very much in line with what I thought about it as well. We talked about that telling conversation that occurred about a half hour or so in. Before that time, although it was deliberately measured, I thought it was somewhat too laboured. But given subsequent developments, it became compelling, certainly most disturbing. And to that end, the messaging about women's and Indigenous rights is hard. Sure, it could be even harder, but I thought it was appropriate to the subject matter that we were dealing with. So, I mean, it's a very powerful film, The Drover's Wife, but it's got this, I reckon it leaves a lasting impression. It's a film that I'll be referencing, no doubt, in future when they do period dramas, Australian period dramas, similarly to The Nightingale. And it's interesting that both have been sort of come out within a few years of one another. I want more Australian movies like that, telling the story, the harsh stories of the way that this land was forged, and that, you know, we know the stories of how many Indigenous Australians were really, I mean, they were treated so badly by white man when white man came along, and they were treated, it was shameful. And, you know, saying sorry as we did, our Prime Minister did a few years ago, isn't going to erase the oppression that is the hallmark, unfortunately, of white man's arrival. And that's what The Drover's Wife deals with.
Definitely. So, and I think we need more of those stories as well. I know a young filmmaker at the moment who is trying to get a film off the ground that talks about the Queensland slave trade. And I don't think most Australians would even realise that we had a slave trade that worked much the same way as the American slave trade.
I mean, it's interesting to me also when you reflect, we're obviously Australians and we're proud of our country, but we're also ashamed of what's gone on in the past. Unfortunately, it's a common story. It's not just ours. You look at America, the treatment, et cetera, for them, and the way that the African Americans have sort of grown up, and I mean, it's disgusting. But there's so many others, the British, and then you go beyond the sort of the cultural milieu of those three nations. And unfortunately, there's a lot of heartache and heartbreak in the stories of a lot of countries and the way that they've treated their Indigenous folk, isn't there? So let's give some scores. Anything further you wanted to add, Peter?
No, I was just, I think it's great to see Leah Purcell actually pull back from being overly harsh that The Nightingale, for example, and some other films have portrayed, because she is going for something a bit more contemplative. And because of that, as I said, those references to abuse of women, treatment of Indigenous people, etc., she wants to leave the audience, I can see the way she directed it, with a lasting impression of something that she wants them to discuss, rather than going away from the cinema thinking how nasty and violent and oppressive this film was. Let's look at the issues and discuss them. So I think that works really well.
Well, this is the first Australian feature film, Peter, with an Indigenous woman writing, directing, performing the lead role.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I like.
But it's taken until 2022. Why? No, seriously. I mean, that to me is again an indictment of our industry and the way that this works. I mean, let's be honest. Indigenous Australians overall are noted for their storytelling.
Exactly, but you have to look at our history, and as well as overseas, the way that women, for example, are now emerging much more strongly in making films, Indigenous people, etc. This is something that has to take a period of time to emerge because of the dominance of the white industry.
Yeah, well, it's way beyond time. So let's start with Jackie, 7.5 out of 10. I also have 7.5 out of 10. So, Dave?
Yeah, I'm giving it 7.5 out of 10 as well, just because I did want that little bit of nastiness that wasn't there.
Fair enough. And Peter?
I really enjoyed the film, 8 out of 10.
Okay, so similar